Oh, to the Levites, that's true, yeah. Right. So it's like they went priests, right?
All right, let's go ahead and bring it back together here. Grab my book.
Oh, right, yes.
So, where did we notice the law at work in this text? Everywhere. Yeah, a lot of law in this text. I would agree wholeheartedly. In fact, one way of reading this is that Israel, in a sense, is functioning as the punishing aspect of the law against the nations in the land. So there's that line. It's not because you were good that God is giving this land. It's because of how evil the nations that are there are, that God is saying to them. So the law is very much at work all through Joshua. Yeah. What else do we see? Where else did the law strike us?
We were talking about circumcision.
Oh, yeah.
Is that because of the law?
So circumcision, yes. So circumcision predates the giving of the Mosaic law, or the Moses' law, right? It's because Abraham is commanded, but it's a command. It is a function of the law, and it's a sign of that. It's a little strange in Joshua that just before they go on this big conquest, they have their army circumcised, which seems like poor military planning, but yeah, there they go. They do it.
Well, we wondered why they hadn't already. We assumed they...
Yeah, and why weren't they circumcised when they were, on the 8th day like they're supposed to be? And, Jesus is circumcised on the 8th day according to the Gospel of Luke, for example. Yeah, good question. We already see that there's the mismatch between what is supposed to happen and what actually happens is clear right from the beginning with Israel, right? And actually even before Israel, it's clear that there's this mismatch between what is commanded and what is actually carried out, what is actually done. Yeah. Where else did we notice the law? Yeah.
I think it's similar to what you were just saying, that God commanded them to kill everybody that they're going into.
Right.
And they don't do that. Like the Gibeonites and whatnot, they made wood cutters and water carriers and whatnot because they had sworn that oath and whatnot. But the law was clear. God said, you will do this, and they didn't.
Yeah, so the clearness of God ordering, to kill these people, war crimes, we would call those war crimes today. War crimes, that concept won't be invented for another 2,500 years or so, but no more, 3,500 years. Anyway, but I mean, that's what's being commanded here, and they don't do it. Yeah, and over again. So you mentioned is it Gibeonites? Is that what I'm remembering right? Who pretend to be from far away, and so make a treaty. And then afterward, they're like, well, I guess we have to honor this because we swore in God's name to do it, basically, and so we have to honor this false treaty we made, or this treaty under false pretenses with them. I think another good reminder, too, is like this command cannot be taken, or ought not to be taken, as a universal for all times command. So if ever you need an example of the law being, of the commands being given for a specific time and place, here's a good one. This does not go beyond the time of Joshua. In fact, depending on how you understand the book of Joshua and how it's historically crafted, it may not even have really been there at the time of Joshua, but is sort of a later looking back. But clearly in the text, this is only for this time, and this is for a very specific reason. And in the same way, like I said, that the nations who are in the land, who apparently have some kind of relationship with God, whether they know God or not, this is seen or portrayed as the consequences of their actions, of their evilness. In some ways, God is liberating the land itself from these evil peoples. Like God says, I will do to you, Israel, if you go in and in the curses in Deuteronomy, for example. Yeah?
Which specific command are you talking about? Is not circumcision or the kill everybody?
Both, actually. Yeah, so the question was, which specific command are we talking about, circumcision or the kill everybody? Yeah, kill everybody is definitely not for all times and places, but neither is circumcision, actually. Yeah, for everyone in all times. Yeah.
was very graphic. It says each time, and take the sword, go in and
Yeah.
kill them all.
Yeah. Yeah. Very graphic. Go in and take the sword. Actually, from having read accounts of other accounts from this time of battles, this is actually far less graphic. When kings boast about the ways that they defeated their opponents, like the depictions are so violent and just so disturbing. I won't even say them, but the Assyrian Empire, for example, who will come up later, we will hear about Assyria. I had an Old Testament professor who said they were kind of the Nazis of the ancient world, in that they were as absolutely dehumanizing as possible to the people that they conquered. And you think the Roman crucifixion is bad. They did things that were far worse than that, as a way of, this is what happens to anyone who opposes us. And so they were absolutely brutal. So in fact, what's described here in Joshua is less brutal than that. Yeah.
God's commands about the battles weren't consistent, because at one, somebody got killed for taking the spoils of the battle, and the next one he said you can take what's...
Yeah, sometimes, exactly. There is some inconsistency through Joshua. I was noticing that too this read through. Of sometimes they're allowed to take some spoils, certain spoils, but not others, and sometimes absolutely nothing is allowed. I noticed that too. I don't really have a good response to that, but I noticed that too. Yeah?
But that was like one of the very first battles in
yeah.
They told him not to take the spoils, and then that proved why, because then trouble happened.
Because that's where Achan
but then
took
all
some
the
of
other
those.
battles, it seemed like
Yeah.
they were allowed to do it. But so I think he was making a big point.
Oh, maybe that's it. So I'm going to try and re-summarize for the recording what you said, Cheryl. So the battle at Ai, and I think at Jericho too, those are the first two battles they have in Joshua. It's very specifically said don't take any of the spoils, and Ai is where the family of Achan takes some of the spoils. I can't remember exactly, but bad things happen as a result of that. And so maybe it was making a point in those first couple battles, and it wasn't as strictly enforced later on.
I noticed that when he does allow them to take spoils, it's for the house of God.
Yeah.
It's taken collectively for the betterment of the whole Israelites, or anybody can take it.
So the question was, sometimes spoils are dedicated to the house of God and the sanctuary of the Lord. And yeah, that would be collective. I think collective is a good way of thinking about that. So they would go into the sort of central treasury. Now, there's not a church treasury and a government treasury. They're not separate things, right? And the idea is that would be used, one, for the worship, but also to aid the needy. I mean, we saw some of that in Deuteronomy of how there are responsibility to care for those, the fatherless, the immigrant, or the alien. I can't remember what they call it in this translation, but yeah. Gur is the word in Hebrew. Yeah.
I wondered what the devoted things were that they couldn't take.
So devoted, that word, when I talk about cherem warfare, the things that are to be destroyed, that's in this, they mostly translate that word as devoted. And so when it's talking about devoted, it's the things that you are not allowed to take, basically, the things that must be destroyed. Sometimes, I think the NRSV translates it devoted to destruction often. This one just said things devoted most of the time in the NIV. I noticed this reading. But yeah, that's what that is. Where do we notice the gospel? Where do we notice the gospel in this? Did we notice the gospel anywhere in this?
City of refuge.
Cities of refuge again. So we hear about these cities that are set aside for, in the case of accidental killings, that to get away from the law of retaliation, basically, that would happen, that you could go to these cities of refuge, and this was a limit on the cultural practice of honor killing, basically, of rescuing your family's honor by avenging what had happened to somebody from another family. I don't know if I'd call that the gospel exactly. I think that's actually the law working in a protective sense, more so than it is the gospel. But yeah, no, I'm glad that you brought that up. It's important to remember, sometimes we think about law as just bad, but the law is what the world is built on. Like, the law sustains us in this life. The reason that food grows in the fields is because the laws of nature are part of that, and then we can eat, we are creatures who live in the law, but the law is not the final thing for us. That's what we can say here. Yeah. Yeah, there was.
I don't know if it's the gospel, but after you went out and killed all these people, then you had to stand outside until nighttime, then you could come back in and be accepted again.
So the being made clean after things had happened, yeah. So being cleansed from being in contact with dead bodies, maybe dead bodies that you created in war, yeah. But that this made you unclean and that there was a way of coming back in. Yeah, there's something close to the gospel there, at least pointing towards it, yeah.
On page 346, and this is after everyone's gotten their land, the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors.
Yeah.
Not
good.
one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled.
Good. So page 346. Yeah, the Lord gave. Let's see. Lord gave them rest on every side, just as He had sworn their ancestors. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. So there is God keeping promises, and again, despite Israel's failure to do what's commanded throughout this story, there's really never been a time where you have sort of the Israelites are really righteous according to the law here. In fact, I think the point is they won't be, and neither will we. So if you thought you were doing pretty well, look at Israel, God's chosen people, and don't assume you're doing any better, because you're probably not.
Do you know what they did with all the dead bodies? Was one of them.
Oh, like after battles and such? I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. The question was, do you know what was done with bodies after a battle and so on? Yeah, I don't know.
Some people were put on burns.
So there some an example was made of kings. This was standard practice, and again, this is standard practice of ancient warfare. The kings were put on poles, their bodies displayed. Do you remember the limit that was placed in Deuteronomy? This actually becomes important in the New Testament. There's a limit on how long the bodies can be on the poles. They have to be down before sunset. You're not allowed to leave them overnight. And the reason Deuteronomy gives is because anyone who hangs on a pole is what this says, but on a tree, is cursed by God, which comes up in the New Testament, applied to Jesus. That anyone who hangs on a tree, the cross here is interpreted as a tree, is cursed by God. So it's talking about Jesus being under God's curse, actually. Yeah.
And then on 329, the 5 kings that were hanging on the pole.
Yes.
When they took them down, they put them in a cave and placed rocks, which would be like Jesus too, at the mouth of the
Oh, interesting. So we're seeing a parallel here of the 5 kings who are killed, and the rocks are piled at the entrance of the cave. That's interesting. Jesus' burial being placed in a cave, which is what the tomb was, with a rock in front of it. Yeah, this is all very interesting. So I think it's very fruitful to be thinking as we read Joshua, to remember that, and I mentioned this last week, I think, that the name Joshua, so Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua. So the reason we call Jesus Jesus is because the New Testament's written in Greek primarily. And in Greek it's Jesus, but over time the Y becomes a J, and it becomes Jesus. And there's, so when the angel tells Joseph, I think it is in the dream, you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. If we translated that, you will call his name Joshua, for he will save his people from his sins. How is Jesus being compared to this Joshua in the book of Joshua? And it's interesting that we're seeing Jesus actually paralleled with those who are put on a pole, those who are put in the caves, that there's something similar yet different about what happens to Jesus and what Jesus is doing as a second Joshua, which was an early Christian way of talking about Jesus.
All of this mayhem is saving the Israelites.
So this mayhem is saving the Israelites, giving them a place to live.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that way, he's saving those people
at
everyone else's expense.
Yeah, saving those people at everybody else's expense. Yeah, this is part of the trickiness with chosenness. What does it mean for God to choose a people? Well, here it means that these other people aren't chosen, right? And Egypt, we can go back to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is not chosen, right? The Egyptians are not chosen. And what do we do with that? And now as Christians, after Jesus, where the chosen one is what? Put on a pole, on a cross, under God's curse, as Paul says, became sin. He who knew no sin became sin for us. we're going to have a different relationship to that chosenness and what chosenness means than perhaps Israel expected to have at the time that this is written. Karma, you were raising your hand.
Yeah, it seems to me that some of the stuff is just the way they handled situations. For example, raising people on a pole or putting them in a tomb with rocks.
Yeah.
Is part of what they did.
Yeah.
Culturally, but also I'm wondering, you said, I really didn't understand what you said about taking them down before sunset. Does God's curse go away at sunset? Or what?
That's it. You know, I don't know exactly what the idea is. So, okay, so the question, or the first comment you made was that a lot of these practices of putting on a pole, that sort of thing, were just practices of warfare at the time, which is true. Even the heaping of stones as sort of a witness against them. It's like, this is a reminder, this pile of stones. Well, under that is, you know, the evil king that did this or that or whatever, you know, like functions as a monument. These are things that are part of the way that culture and those cultures existed. So a reader of Joshua in the year 700 BC, let's say, would not be appalled at these things. They'd say, yeah, that's how war works. They would just recognize that. The second question then you asked was, can you remind me what that question was? You didn't understand something I'd said about...
Well, you said we were talking about why they had to be taken down by sunset.
Oh, right. Thank you.
And the reply was that it was a curse.
So Deuteronomy says you can't leave anybody who's executed on a pole up overnight because God's curse is on them. And I think it doesn't give exactly like why is sundown the important time. I wonder if it's...
Is God's curse on me if I hung him on a pole then? Is that what it...
Oh, is the curse sort of infectious? Maybe.
Well, no,
I don't know.
I'm trying to understand why that's a big deal.
Well, so the person who is put up there is seen as cursed. That there's dishonor. You could think about it in terms of honor and shame. It's especially shameful. This is why the Romans crucified people. The Romans crucified people because it killed them in a shameful, embarrassing way. Like, you're absolutely exposed up in front of everyone, and it made an example, right? And that's the same reason for putting on poles. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're saying...
Then why did they care that they took them down?
Yeah, so it's interesting that Deuteronomy limits it. Because I think the normal practice is you leave them, and you'll see this in a few other places, that there's this shame associated with someone's remains being eaten by wild animals or by birds. Or dogs happens at one time. And so the shame of being denied a proper burial. In fact, often burials are mentioned, like he was gathered to his ancestors. That's what that means. It means he was buried. And the whole burial process, you would put them in this tomb for a year or so, and then you would take the bones, and you'd collect the bones in an ossuary, a bone box, and you'd collect that, and that would be gathered with the other bone boxes of the ancestors. That's literally what that means, gathered to the ancestors. I remember, so Ezekiel 37, there's this story of the dry bones, the valley of dry bones. Do you remember this? And the implication of that is that this is a battle, or the aftermath of a battle, where all of these people have died and they have not been buried. And there's something incredibly sad about that. And so the fact that this resurrection happens to these people who have not been properly buried it's even more shocking. The resurrection is even more shocking than if they had been, honored and gathered, but that they were just left out in the field and, eaten by birds or whatever, is seen as sad. So there's something about, like, even in defeat, even when you've defeated somebody that God commanded you to defeat, there's still some kind of honor almost to be shown to them, or at least decency. And again, it's pretty limited, right? I mean, we wouldn't call that acting decently, but there is a limit being placed on that. The other thing I want to connect that to, so this is Deuteronomy again. Do you remember in Deuteronomy there's the limit on how many times a person can be whipped? Did you notice that? So if somebody's being whipped as a punishment, you cannot whip them 40 times. That's what it says. Because I can't remember exactly the wording, but basically it would be too shameful for the person. Like, 39 is okay, but 40 is too many. And Paul references this in the New Testament. He says, I think 3 times I was whipped with 40 lashes minus 1, because 40 is too much. It's too excessive of punishment. But that there's the sense of, like, how excessive a punishment is, and it's connected more to shame and honor than it is to the sorts of values we would place on it. But in the ancient world, your sense of honor, being able to stand before others and not be ashamed before others, kind of is life. It's a much bigger deal than we tend to make of it in our culture. We have a different set of values there. But like, this is too embarrassing if you do it to this. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on that. Whereas I think for us moderns, we tend to say, well, if they're dead, it kind of doesn't matter. Like, it matters a little bit, but not all that much. But for them, it's like, no, it absolutely matters what happens after, to your body, to your remains. Yeah.
There's another parallel with a crucifixion on page 328. The sun stands still.
Oh.
Yeah. It's like the other one was it eclipsed, but it's still things stopped.
Yeah. So on page 328, this story of the sun being up for like more than a day, I think is what it is. The sun stands still so that they can finish the battle for like a day and a half or something like that. I don't remember how long it is. And maybe we can see a connection to the crucifixion when the sun is darkened. Kind of the opposite happens. The sun goes away for a bit when Jesus, at a time that it's not supposed to, middle of the afternoon. And whether that's an eclipse or how we understand that, I don't know. But
I thought what he said, what they say after that is interesting too. There's never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being.
Yeah. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel, it says. Yeah, isn't that interesting? So never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. So here in this text, the fact that the sun stood still is a sign of God's favor to them. Isn't that interesting? That Joshua could ask God or command the sun, and it listened, which is an implication. God listened to Joshua. And, how do you understand the sun stopping? I don't know. We don't need to explain the how of it, but the fact that Joshua could speak and God would listen is seen here as a sign of God's favor, right? Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Now, and again, if you imagine, as I talked about last week, Joshua through Kings being put together and assembled from the perspective of Israel being driven out from the land themselves by the Babylonians, them going into exile, they're looking back and they say, look, the Lord was fighting for us at this time. And how has that changed? Why has that changed now? But this is comfort for a people in exile. There at least was a time when God did, right? Yeah.
Going back to the unclean, if we remember earlier, carcasses and clothing and things like that were being touched by an individual, they were to, be away until the evening when they then became clean. And I wonder if the bodies weren't to be touched until the evening after they were clean themselves.
Interesting.
And then it allowed the individuals to be able to take them away and put them in a cave or whatever they did with them.
So maybe there's some connection between the bodies needing to be taken down before evening and the way that many of the cleanliness things where you wash and are clean then when the sun goes down, that there's some connection there. There might be. I don't know, but that's an interesting connection to make. Yeah. What else surprised us? We're kind of in the surprised us mode at this point, but yeah.
So I just had a little question. We hear this recording of history from this.
Yeah.
But there were many other people involved. Are there other recordings of what the Israelites did?
No, at least not. So the question was, are there other kind of historical records of this conquest? Basically, that's what the question is, right? Outside of this, no, there aren't. And so I think I mentioned this last week that there's an inconsistency between the archaeological record in the way that we have it, which could be in our interpretation of it too, because a lot of it's shards of pottery and figuring out what shards of pottery mean, and the way that the story is told here. So one of the clear examples of that is the best, I'd say the consensus or close to consensus interpretation of the archaeological site of Jericho, for example, is that Jericho was probably uninhabited from about, I think, 1700 BC until like 1000 BC. So there's like a several century period where it's uninhabited, where it had been destroyed, basically. Our guesses for the time of the Exodus puts Israel arriving during that time into Jericho. Now it's interesting, Jericho's walls were destroyed by an earthquake in around 1700 BC. So there's this, like, that's what the archaeological evidence. So there's a mismatch there. And possibly it means that we're dating, maybe the dating of the archaeological evidence is, I don't know exactly how that happens, but maybe there's some mistakes there. Maybe we're wrong about the timing of the Exodus. You know, maybe our sort of guesses, and there's a range of guesses. I've seen ranges as early as like 2400, which is, 1,000 years earlier than I think is the most likely reading. Whereas old Jewish numbering from, this is after Jesus, but not long after Jesus, I think puts the time of the Exodus around like 900 BC, so like several centuries later. So there's a lot of uncertainty on these things. And so how does the account here in Joshua line up or differ from the archaeological record is kind of an open question, I think. And you'll get different interpretations of that. And so the earliest archaeological, certainly referring to Israel stuff that we have comes from the time of the monarchy. So about the year 1000, a little, maybe as late as 900, somewhere in that range, where you have references to David. Now we have references to Yahweh a little earlier than that, but it's Yahweh being worshipped alongside other gods, which is also interesting. That there's this, we have archaeological evidence of this idolatry basically happening. But it's not until later when Israel's really a monarchy power that other kingdoms start to really interact with them. Also, this period of time is a time when, so the land of Israel, if you remember on a map, Israel's the bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa, right? So that land is right, so it's an important crossroads in a lot of ways, which means that it was almost always under the influence of some other empire, whether it was the Romans or the Greeks, Alexander the Great, or the Persians or Babylonians or Assyrians or Egyptians, that they were always kind of passing this land back and forth. But there is this period during the Exodus time when things are relatively peaceful. I mean, there's fighting going on inside the land of Israel, but the other, the Egyptians are just fairly weak at this time, and the other empires haven't really risen up either. And once they do, that becomes a problem again. So, and we'll read that as we get to that with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Yeah, Cheryl.
I have one about surprise, and it's like, so when Joshua had 6 of the tribes stand below Mount Ebal and 6 of the tribes at the other mountain across from each other, one was doing the blessings and one was giving curses. What's the significance of that even being involved in this?
So do you remember the pages on that? I'm trying to remember exactly where that happens. But it was talking about the sort of ceremony where you have representatives of half of Israel at one mountain and half of the other mountain kind of facing each other across this valley. I don't know the specific mountains in question. I don't know how close they were. And then sort of shouting. One shouts the blessings of the law, and one shouts the curses of the law. And I think it's just a ritual enactment. It's not that different from when we do the Psalms, and I say something and then you echo the next verse back. It's something like that, I think.
Well, Moses commanded them to build an altar there.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they were commanded. So there's an altar commanded to be built there, which you can see is maybe important to especially make sure it was recorded, because there were a lot of unauthorized altars that, and as we go, we'll see, become an issue. The high places where Israel was worshiping. Yeah. What about the story? Did you notice the story, speaking of altars being built, the story of, is it Gideon? Not Gideon. Reuben. The stories of Reuben, wrong name. The Reubenites building this altar. I think it's Reuben and Gad, if I remember right. Which you can combine kind of makes Gideon. Anyway, building this giant altar, and then everybody's like, you've immediately turned away from God. And they're like, no, we're just building this as a reminder that we should go to your altar in Jerusalem, or when it's built. And I find that whole story, and then they're like, okay, that's fine then. They all go back. And it's like, is that actually what they were doing? Did they just get caught and they sort of changed? Yeah. Oh, this big altar, it's just a reminder altar. Oh, okay, yeah. I don't know. There's a lot of that sort of thing going on, and you have to wonder what the intentions were there. I'm not sure, but it satisfied the others. So they didn't fight against each other, although it's interesting that as soon as they're in the land, they're immediately not trusting each other. You notice that right away.
It was on page 326.
326. Oh, that's the calling back and forth? Yeah. Mountain to mountain.
348 is the altar.
And what is the altar?
348.
348 is the Reuben and Gad. Yeah, altar. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they gave the altar this name, a witness between us that the Lord is God. It's like, okay, well, that's a better interpretation than maybe what the original idea was. Because you have to realize, you don't really want your people to have to, if you're a nation, if you're the government of a nation, you don't really want your people to have to regularly go to another nation and do their worship. You'd like your people to stay with you, and better yet, you'd like other people to come to you. This becomes an issue when you have a united kingdom that then splits into two, and the northern kingdom, which does not contain Jerusalem, builds their own sites of worship at the north and south end of their kingdom, so that their people don't have to go to Jerusalem. This becomes a standing point of contention, basically for as long as these two kingdoms exist. Even into Jesus' time, actually, because the Samaritans are following some of the practice in some ways of that northern kingdom. And the Jews in Judah, or Judea at the time, as it's called, are saying, well, no, it needs to be in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Another question was, when they crossed the Jordan and they made that camp at Gilgal, why then did, after many of the battles, they came back and regrouped and went back to Gilgal, to their camp?
Yeah, so why do they keep returning to Gilgal after these battles? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it's just logistics or if there's more reason. Gilgal becomes sort of important because they do some of these kind of ritual remembrance activities at Gilgal.
I think the group that went over there had made a comment, though, that they liked the land and they felt it was their...
Yes, that's Gilead.
Yeah.
So there's Gilgal and there's Gilead, which are different. Gilgal's on the west side of the Jordan. Gilead's on the east side of the Jordan River. Yeah, and so that's where Reuben and Gad, and they make their altar. Yeah, that's that whole Gilead, which it almost reads as an explanation of, why are some of the tribes over there? Shouldn't they be over here with the rest of us? So, yeah, but nope, they want to be, they liked the land. Any other things that we noticed or questions we have?
Yeah, this may sound strange, but I actually felt in Joshua that they were getting along better because
better than
previously.
Yes, okay.
The Israelites were. They seemed pretty compliant about, well, this is yours and this is yours and this is yours. Drawing lots for land, and they said, okay, that's mine.
Yeah.
The daughters that got property, the Levites got some. Joshua got to choose his.
So noticing that the people seem to get along actually pretty well in Joshua. I'd say, they maybe get along the best in the book of Joshua than they do before or after, until maybe David's time, and even then, or maybe Solomon. Maybe under Solomon, they're like this really the peaceful time of the kingdom, and then as soon as Solomon dies, it all falls apart. But yeah, this is one of the kind of a high point as far as inter-Israelite relations goes, I suppose. Yeah.
On page 331, it talks about Joshua took this entire land, hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, Arabah, the mountains of Israel, the foothills, from Mount Harlock to Mount Hermon. How far is that really? Where is it? Isn't that in Goshen, Egypt, the Delta, where they were before?
On page 330, the description of Joshua subdued the whole region, and it says all of these places. This is basically all of Israel, but even larger than actually the modern day boundaries of Israel would be. So this is from the far north to Egypt, parts that would be in or close to Egypt.
But then when you go to the next page, when Joshua had grown old, the Lord said to him, "You're now very old. There's still very large areas of land to take over."
Yes, good. I'm glad that. So then on the next page, it seems that the land hasn't been adequately taken, and that is going to be a consistent tension in Joshua. As we've already heard, that there's this description of like, this is what you were supposed to do, and it never quite happens. And this is also happening here. Judges will get this more so too, in that Judges, it's in some ways the book of Judges makes more sense if you assume a lot of these Joshua things never actually took place. Because it's like there's much less order in the land than the book of Joshua gives. Joshua's a little more optimistic. The book of Joshua, is a little more optimistic than Judges is, for example. I saw a hand over here.
Well, one of the things that surprised me is a couple of times it talks about then the land had rest from war.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting that they mentioned the land.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that you noticed that. So talking about the land having rest from war. And remember, when God is telling Israel to go in and drive out the other nations, it's one of the benefits of it is benefit to the land. God will remember the land. And also in the curses in, I think in Deuteronomy, if not there, then in Leviticus. But the curses for disobedience is, I will basically liberate the land from you, that the land will have rest from you. Yeah, God cares about the land, which is really interesting and strange for us to think of. We usually think of the people on the land, but God actually cares about the land itself. Yeah.
On page 351, in the third paragraph, it goes, "This stone will be a witness against it, as it has heard all the words."
Isn't that great?
And it will be a witness. It's like it's alive or something.
Yeah. So page 351, right at the end of Joshua, Joshua sets up this stone as a witness. And he says, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God. Yeah, it's like the stone's alive. Remember, Jesus has a saying a little bit like this, that if when the Pharisees, when he's coming in on Palm Sunday, and the Pharisees say, make your followers quiet, and he says, I tell you the truth, if they were silent, these very stones would cry out, right? That there's a sense that creation itself is alive in some way, in a way that we as modern people really don't have much sense to. But yeah, the stones are witnesses in the Psalms, and elsewhere we'll hear about the mountains being called as witnesses, or heaven and earth being called as witnesses. Psalm, is it 19, I think? The heavens declare the glory of God. That there's a sense that creation itself is speaking, is, part of this in relationship with God in the same way that the land is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We hear that phrase today. Think of how many times somebody said, "Oh, these walls can talk."
Oh yeah.
That phrase came to mind. I think you hear that frequently.
Yeah. If these walls could talk, yeah. What stories they tell. Yeah, and there is a sense in which places do bear witness to what's happened in them, right? Like the sanctuary. Is it okay if I tell the story about you, maybe? Or no, not you, but I'm going to tell a story about somebody. But I remember somebody telling me, somebody in that half of the room, telling me, this is when we'd been outside for a while, that the first time they came into the building, they walked by the sanctuary, and it just immediately brought tears to their eyes, right? Just seeing the sanctuary brought tears to their eyes because they'd been away from it for so long. That sanctuary bore witness to all of the things that had happened, over the years of experience here. And so, there's something to that. And I think we kind of in our modern scientific minds tend to discount things like that more than we ought to, but there is some reality to that. And, you can explain it all psychologically or whatever, but it's real. Whatever it is, it's real. Yeah.
I will put my bow in the sky.
I will put my bow in the sky, God says, yeah. And as a reminder to me that, the rainbow reminds God to keep the promise that God makes. That's actually a good example in the end of the Noah stories of Genesis chapter 8, I think, maybe 9, that God makes the covenant with all of creation. It's actually not just with Noah and his family. God makes this promise to the creation, not to do this flooding thing again, right? And it's not just Noah. It's not just humanity that's part of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is something that's bothered me for a few years, is that at Christmas time we focus on Bethlehem, right there. The creator of the world came to be with us. What happened in the Pacific Northwest? Surely all of creation rejoiced in some way.
Yeah. So we focus on, in the Christmas story, the incarnation, the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, but this is the creator of everything happening. There's C.S. Lewis has a fiction, I think it's a trilogy called the Space Trilogy. It's not as well known, but as his like Narnia books. It's not as good as his Narnia books. But one of the things in it is that each planet he imagines, like Mercury, Venus, and all that, as having their own sort of history and relationship with God the Creator in a different way. And in one of them, I think it's the one where they go to Venus. Venus is newer than Earth. The life on Venus is newer than Earth. It was created, or the life there was done after Earth. And one of the things that I think they remember saying in that one is life takes human form now because something happened on Earth at some point, that the Creator became human. And that has an impact in C.S. Lewis's imagination on, the solar system, that everything now is affected, all of creation is affected by that. So that's just an imagining of that. But yeah, what happens globally or universally as a result of God, the Creator, becoming a creature? Yeah.
Kind of a blessing, but I have a wondering about, growing up, we learned about Rahab and we learned about Joshua's battle of Jericho.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But, there's only a few sentences in here in terms of how, it just says they went and they, into the house of prostitute Rahab, and then she hit him, right?
Yep.
And I just have wonderings about that. And then isn't Rahab connected to the lineage of Jesus?
She is, yes, good. I wrote in my margin, so this is talking about Rahab. So this is page 316. Joshua secretly sends 2 spies from Shittim, look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. Very next sentence. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. I wrote some spies on the side, okay. Is that really the place to go? I don't know. But yeah, that Rahab, hides them. She knows, she says, the whole land is in fear of you. We know that God has given you the land. Like there's this sense that she's bearing witness to this. And then, Rahab is included by Matthew, I think, if I remember right, in the lineage of Jesus.
And then the Scarlet Road.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To warn them.
To let them know where she is in the wall. And also her house is in the wall.
Yeah.
And the walls fall down, but apparently hers doesn't. Isn't that interesting? Did you notice that? Like, God is involved in sparing her, apparently. Yeah.
But people are unlikely to look in a woman's house.
Especially a woman of ill repute, right? Yeah.
They'll overlook that.
Yeah.
So it's a good place.
Maybe it's a good hiding place. Maybe they were just being wary spies. Didn't have any ulterior motives, I'm sure. Yeah.
And the funny thing is, she put that scarlet ribbon out right away, but it's like, okay, lots of time went by. Wouldn't the people
be a little suspicious about that? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the scarlet ribbon's maybe not the most subtle hint. I don't know. Yeah.
So how did the red light district get it?
Oh yeah, so scarlet ribbon, red light. Yeah, this may be a very old association. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I think just noticing too. So we're going to get this as we go forward. In fact, I should probably move a little bit to where we're going. So Joshua has this sense, the book of Joshua. There's this sense of you must preserve it's not exactly purity, but keep your relationship to God special, and that involves the driving out, killing of all of these nations in the land. And yet exceptions are made even in Joshua. Right, and Rahab's a great example. Rahab and her family, it says they still live among Israel to this day, it says. The Gibeonites is another example where, it's through dishonest means, but they also stay, and they actually get to become servants of the temple, right? They're water carriers and things for the Levites. That is actually a somewhat honorable position that they're given eventually. It doesn't exactly start that way, but that's sort of... they're not completely relegated outside. Do you remember in Deuteronomy there was that line about Moabites? And the Moabites, no Moabite down to the 10th generation shall be in the assembly of the Lord. So this week we're going to read 2 books. We're going to read Judges and Ruth. And Ruth is about a Moabite. Ruth is a Moabite. The woman Ruth is a Moabite. And she's also the great-grandmother of David, the king. And so here is a really interesting story where we have this no Moabites allowed, and then yet here's Ruth, the story of Ruth, which is about a faithful Moabite who becomes part of the royal lineage. And again, she's also included in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew. Yeah. The other woman who's included in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew is Tamar. Do you remember that story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38? or 38, I think, where she's, again, prostituting, right? I mean, she kind of tricks her father-in-law to do what his sons wouldn't do for her. And at the end of the story, she's called more right. Judah says, she is more righteous than I. She also shows up in the lineage of Jesus. So it's very interesting, the women that are included in the lineage of Jesus and how there's something outside the law happening here, right? So the law is good, it's important, but it is not the final thing. And even throughout the books of the law, even though we're out of those technically now, there's exceptions happening all the time in them. That there's actually something else, another word that comes after these.
Well, God makes random choices, too.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call them random choices, but God makes choices according to no one's counsel but God's own. Yeah, unexpected choices. Choices that we can't explain. Yeah, and I think that's right.
Impossible one.
Impossible choices, yeah. And we could say extra legal choices, right? Because part of it is, if you could rationalize it, to try and rationalize the decisions God makes is to try and put God's decision back in a legal framework by which you can understand and reason out everything. God chose Israel because, here's an attempt to do that. God chose Israel because they were more faithful than the other peoples, which Deuteronomy very clearly says that is not why God chose you, right? And so God's decisions just won't be reducible by the law. Yeah, they're beyond us, is another way of putting that.
And Jesus was the cornerstone they threw out.
Yeah, the cornerstone which the builders have rejected has become the chief, or the head of the corner. There's different ways of translating that, but yeah. Yeah, that the one that seemed like it would not fit somehow became the most important stone. Yeah.
But I think we try and put the Bible in a black and white, concrete, this is the law, this is not the law.
Yeah.
Really more and more what I'm saying is these rules are here for a reason, but there's all kinds of gray area.
Yeah.
And God has the final say.
I think, yeah, good.
The fair and unfair of trickery. The first time I read through the Bible, the trickery.
Yeah.
3 years ago really bothered me.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking we're holding up Rachel and all these people as almost as idols. I was really.
I think we can. I think we absolutely can.
Mm-hmm. And then, oh wow, they're just normal, everyday folk like me who make mistakes all the time, and God uses them.
Yeah, and noticing how often, especially in the Old Testament, but this happens in the New Testament as well, but how often these heroic figures are taken down a notch, just constantly. I think I said this early on, but the hero, the only hero of the Bible is God. Everyone else is not the hero. Even if God uses them to do heroic things, even David, who's probably the closest, is not the hero. And in fact, his family completely falls apart towards the end of his life. There's all sorts of terrible violence that happens in his family. That's attributed to him being a man of bloodshed, actually. Like that it's blamed on him in a sense, that it's seen as consequences of who he is. That's a good, actually, segue into Judges. So I already said a little bit about Ruth, but let me talk about Judges, because that's what we're going to be reading the first, I think, through Thursday, if I remember right, we're in Judges. And my computer went to sleep, so I've got to wake it up so I have my notes in front of me. There it is. So the first thing I want to say about Judges is kind of what I already was just saying here, is it's easy to take, or a common way of reading Judges is to look at each of the judges, who are these people who have been raised up by God to deliver Israel from oppression. That's basically what the judges are. To lift them up as heroes or examples to follow. I think the book of Judges doesn't want them to be examples to be followed. In fact, all of them, with a couple possible exceptions for whom we just don't hear much about, the ones that are told in detail anyways, tend to be ones that you're like, I don't think I should follow this. Samson's probably the best example of this, where Samson is this, heroic, berserk kind of fighter guy, where he says the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and he gets super strong, and he takes a donkey's jawbone or something, whatever's at hand, and he goes and he kills Philistines. Like, that's what he does. And the whole story of Samson, though, is Samson is a fool. I mean, Samson is a fool the whole time. God uses him to deliver the Israelites from oppression, but Samson is not an example to follow. Nobody should follow example. And Samson ends with his eyes lost because he's been captured, pushing down the place of the temple where he's been like tied to the pillars, and getting strength to basically kill himself and everybody else in there by collapsing it. Like, that's Samson's end. This is not an example to follow. And so in the same way that, like, the Bible is not a book according to the law, in a sense, that offers a black and white, here's what's right, here's what's wrong, and that's it. The Bible is much messier than that, in the way that our lives are much messier than that the world is much messier than that. And part of what's happening here is recognizing the law. Again, the law is good, but it is not the final thing, and it's not able to do. So Paul will say in Romans that in Jesus Christ, God did what the law was unable to do by actually dealing with sin in the flesh. That the law couldn't do that. It can tell you what needs to happen, but it can't actually make it happen. It can make things better. It can improve things, but it can't actually, bring about, if you want to say, the kingdom of God or something like that. It can't bring about the way that things ought to be. It's just not able to do that. It's beyond the law's power to do that. It doesn't make the law bad, but it's not the final word. It's not the final thing. So Judges is going to be another example of that. Another thing is Judges is a little bit strange to us because we think of a judge as in a courtroom judge. So we think of the judicial system, the judge system, as being separate from the rest of the government. In fact, in our system, right, the judges sort of keep the executive and the legislative branch in line, right? That's part of their role, is they say, well, this is actually not constitutional, the Supreme Court especially, but that's part of what judges do. That's a modern invention. That does not exist at this time. So a judge is you can almost better translate it as leader or governor, in a sense. Governor is maybe a little too formal, but like somebody who governs, somebody who rules, somebody who leads. And part of that is judging between people who have disputes, which is where like judge gets to be used here. But there's not an idea of the law of judgment or even justice, which comes from the same word in Hebrew, of being sort of an abstract principle that everyone should follow in the way that we have it, that like we talk about the rule of law, that the law is the thing that all of us, including our leaders, are under. In the ancient world, the law comes from the ruler, right? And so the judge is the one who gives the justice, and justice is then doing what the judge says. Now, what's unique in Israel and in Scripture is that human ruler has another ruler above them. So whereas the Egyptians would say, well, Pharaoh is a descendant of the gods. He's divine, right? Whatever he says goes. Israel can't say that about their kings or their judges. They are under the judge, who is God, the one who... And so justice then begins to take on something closer to what we have in the modern time, of this idea of sort of a general principle of fairness or equality or something like that. But even in the Bible, it's not understood as being abstract. It's being understood as flowing directly from God. Like it's being ordered rightly under God. So I don't know if you noticed in the intro to Joshua and Judges, the little invitation at the beginning of, I think it's on page 314. They say in the invitation that Joshua and Judges are making the case for Israel to have a king. I'm going to disagree a little bit with their interpretation here, because there is this recurring sentence. In fact, the very last words of the book of Judges are, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit," which is clearly seen as a bad thing. I don't think they're making the case for a human king. I think the point of that is, why does Israel have no king? It's because they no longer are regarding the Lord as their king. They're no longer, like, God should have been their king all along. They eventually, in Samuel, will demand a human king and get one, and it goes poorly. Then they get one that goes better, but then sort of bad. And another one that seems everything goes really well, and then as soon as he died, everything falls apart because it turns out he was actually not as great as... He was only able to hold it together through force of will through his life, basically. But like, kings are not regarded as good in really anywhere in Scripture. Some kings are better than others, and there is a way of being a faithful king, but like we read last week in Deuteronomy, what is the king supposed to do? They're supposed to study the Torah. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to teach the Word of God. They're not supposed to make alliances with other nations through marriage. They're not supposed to build up armies. They're not supposed to amass wealth for themselves. It's like, well, that's a really odd picture of a king. Like, that's not... Point to one king who has ever successfully led in that way. I don't think you can find one. And so there's this kind of critique of kingship throughout it as, the Lord should be king, is a way of thinking about that. We're a little bit past our time. Any final questions?
One thing I noticed there in all of this, there's loyalty to God and there's disloyalty. Then they're loyal again, then they're disloyal again. And it shows that man's wisdom is foolishness for God.
Yeah, good. So there's this constant pattern of loyalty to God, disloyalty to God. Loyalty, disloyalty. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Judges in particular is very strong. I mean, that's the sermon today. That's the whole pattern of Judges. Yeah. Last one.
There was a statement in here, which are there to this day, and that was made several times in here. What's the timeline that this...
When is this day? That's a good question. Yeah, so they're still among us to this day, we'll read, or still stands there to this day.
I was wondering what the timeline was when this was written compared to the actual event.
So the short answer is we don't know exactly, and it's also possible that each of those are referring to different days because different parts of this may have been written at different times. I think the broad consensus is that Joshua, in the form we have it now, all put together now, was done around the time of the Babylonian exile, which is several centuries later. That doesn't necessarily mean, so it doesn't mean it was like composed from scratch at that time, but it means that they took the written histories, perhaps, or the oral traditions, or whatever things were around, and they put them into this form at that time. So that to this day, do they apply to the time of the Babylonian exile, or do they apply to whenever the written histories that are being used are put in? So the short answer is I don't know the answer to that. I don't think any of us do. But sometime later, that's all I can say. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question, but unfortunately not one I have a good answer to. Let me close this in prayer, and then we can finish, send you off. Gracious God, I thank you for speaking to us. Help us to continue to wrestle with you. Help us to be challenged and to be comforted by the words that we find. And above all, draw us closer to you through everything that is around us. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.